So today is the 29th of July 2013. We're in Canberra 5 Lovegrove Place interviewing Jack Kershaw and interviewing you, it's myself, Janina Gosseye. So what architecture qualifications did you gain and from which institution?
Oh, I got a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Queensland in 1966. That's as far as I went with the academic side of it. I became very interested in theatre at university, which I can talk about as well if you like, sure. Unless you want to move on.
Oh, we can talk about it now. We can talk about it later. But please.
Yeah, I wasn't very strong, I don't think, as a student in architecture, but I enjoyed being at university, and I branched out from the faculty, which was a bit unusual, and joined in the activities of other faculties, particularly in relation to theatrical productions. Set design was something I did a lot of for the University Dramatic Society, and of course the university architecture students started to do some of their own theatrical reviews while I was still a student.
Was that originally initiated by the law students, or?
Well, yeah, prior to that there was a review called Scoop, which was based on the Oxford and Cambridge intimate review style, and the compere of Scoop was none other than Michael Bryce, the husband of the current Governor-General. He was very suave and wore a dinner jacket and stepped out in between the acts and told jokes. And went on to become quite a notable architect and a graphic designer in his own right. But I think the Faculty of Architecture was quite pleased to see that someone like me had broadened the scope of the faculty by joining up into other areas. And I was actually the stage director of the InterVarsity Drama Festival in 1965, or 66. Sorry, and that involved 13 productions in 13 nights at the Rialto Theatre West End, which was the only venue we could get of any size in Brisbane at the time. In fact, the only theatres available, apart from the little old Avalon Theatre that the university had for its productions, which wasn't adequate for an InterVarsity one, were the Queen Street theatres, Her Majesty's and so on. And we couldn't afford those as students, so we went to the Rialto West End, and with the permission of the owner we rewired it and extended it temporarily for these 13 productions, which were very, at that time, student theatre was really coming into its own. And Jack Thompson, the famous Australian film actor, was the stage director. Sorry, the artistic director. I was the stage director, And so the Faculty of Architecture was quite pleased to see that somebody from their numbers was getting involved in the broader community, because I think there was a bit of pressure on the faculty, which had been started by the great Professor Cummings and Bruce Lucas. Was a little bit under pressure as to whether it should keep going. And
when you say the faculty was supportive, was there everybody in the faculty, or were there certain people that were supporting this type of activity or this type of branching out?
Yeah, I think there were. There was Stan Marcus Kyle in particular, who was very encouraging towards what I was doing, and really in a way helped me get through my final year, where I was really distracted a lot outside the faculty. I'm very grateful for that. He was the main one, I think, who was, quite encouraged to see this going on.
From your perspective, do you see that this notion of architecture lining up with the arts was stronger than architecture aligning with engineering and the more precise sciences?
I think so, although I was always very, we were taught by engineers, and we also did chemistry and geology and other things like that, some of which were probably not fully necessary, but at that time the only courses available to us were the full-blown courses in those faculties. But I particularly remember our engineering lecture, structural engineering lecturer, whose name I can't remember, but it'll come to me, coining a memorable phrase, "an unlikely solution to a non-existent problem," was where he described some architecture. Unlikely solution to a non-existent problem. And that was, that sort of formed a sort of a basis to architecture of that time, which was very much post-war practical solutions to problems, you know, not getting involved with style and artistic movements and so on in many ways, particularly in Brisbane. There were constraints on money, post-war and so on. And the sort of work that we were doing as students was very sort of practical solutions, very, you know, sort of utilitarian solutions to problems. And if anything, it was influenced by, say, Richard Neutra or someone like that. That's about as far as it went with modernism and so on.
So it was more
practical, really. Yes, it was constrained and, you know, and tight, and not really sort of breaking new frontiers.
But were you looking at modernism? When you had architecture history, that was Bannister Fletcher?
Bannister Fletcher.
But was anybody looking at what was happening in Europe or what was happening in the United States, or more contemporary?
Not very much until the arrival of Bill Carr, a lecturer from Melbourne University, who broke new ground with us, and even some of the students in my year thought that he was a wacko, you know, and that he was off for the fairies, and yet, because he was talking about Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer and Mies van der Rohe and so on. And I suppose the best student in our year, Lawson McCowan, was the past master at producing these very practical designs, very competent designs that you saw in schools and public buildings of that sort around that time in the 60s.
And how big was the group that you studied with?
Oh, the group of students, by the way, they were all male.
No women.
No girls. And we were about 30, I think.
30.
Yeah, and we're coming up to 50 years since we graduated.
So you started in 63?
I started in 61 because it was 6 years course. It was 3 years full-time,
and then
3 years part-time, yeah. And so we worked as students.
And where did you work as a student?
Well, I worked with Prangley and Crofts.
Ah, yes.
And I worked with Trude and Webster. And at Trude and Webster I met Peter O'Gorman, who was also a student working in his later years of his course. And Peter then was obsessed with Frank Lloyd Wright and was producing buildings very derivative of Frank Lloyd Wright. And other architects of Peter's ilk included Eddie Codd, who designed this very table and this very chair that I'm sitting on. He was very good because he not only followed architecture, but he went into furniture design as well. And that was very impressive. And the other architect of the Peter O'Gorman era was Andy Stenders.
And they started practicing.
Stenders and Codd have since come together and been very successful. But it was a fairly sort of constipated course in architecture, looking back. And I think that was because of the conservatism within the establishment at the academic establishment at the university, and Bob Cummings and Bruce Lucas, the founders of the course, having to fit in and not be too controversial.
And what about Karl Langer?
Yes, well, Karl Langer was there, always there in the background as a European town planner, telling us in his inimitable Austrian way that we're a bunch of hicks from living in nowhere, you know. And he was always pushing the boundaries on the frontier of town planning in particular, and design. And he was most welcome, and he was a guest lecturer. And his wife, Gertie, of course, was very well known in artistic circles in Brisbane. And my parents moved in those circles to their credit, to the Brian Johnson Gallery and the Furley Just Gallery, which were very much in the forefront of, you know, opening the eyes of Brisbaneites to culture, as it were. So I was lucky in that regard. And one of the most formative buildings of my growing up was our holiday house at Caloundra, which my father and a builder built in 1945, which is still there today.
Oh, it is.
And it's on the corner of Rook and Hensel Street, Dicky Beach, Caloundra. And we went there every Christmas, and that was the place where we holidayed and enjoyed it, and it had no sewage and no water and no electricity. So,
well, for 1945, that's quite modern design.
Yes, and my father was good like that. He would pick up on a style and pursue it, as was his partner Rod Voller, who is a cousin of Ron Voller, who started the firm, the other firm of which John Voller became a partner, Jessup Bratnell, yeah. And the holiday house was even heritage listed at one stage, and the owner, because my parents sold it, and went on a world trip, by the way, so they didn't leave it to us kids. The owner objected very strongly to the heritage listing.
Because he couldn't change anything.
That's right, and it's still there though.
And did it get listed or it didn't?
It didn't.
Oh.
It did for a while, then it was delisted after an objection. Oh. So this was 2003 when it was listed. And despite its being delisted, it's still there.
That's good. And when did your father start his practice?
Well, he was a Commonwealth Bank architect. And I think he was the Commonwealth Bank architect when he did that building. But I think he started his practice with Rod Voller. Gosh, must have been late 50s. Because the second most influential house or piece of architecture in my life was our own house, which Dad designed at 44 Watson Street, Wilston, which has since been demolished, sadly. And replaced with a those wonderful architects who did the library extension of South Brisbane.
Donovan Hill?
Donovan Hill. Donovan Hill replaced our home at Watson Street, Wilston, with this massive concrete house that cascades down the hill. So the only good thing about that is, I suppose, that the site was, appreciated because it was very rare to build it on such a steep site in those days.
And when was the house? When did your father build the house?
55.
There? 55.
Yeah, 1955, and it was in a similar vein to this holiday house, but it had a low-pitched fibro roof of that American 1940s, 50s style of house.
And where did your father study architecture?
Well, he studied architecture at the Technical College in Brisbane. After it was discovered when he was working in the public service in the 1930s that he had a good rapport with people and also was able to produce good graphics. And he did architecture, and then the war broke out and he was in the engineers in New Guinea. and against the Japanese. So I was born in 1942 while he was in New Guinea. I was born in the country in Queensland, where my mother had come from, at Mundabra, inland from Bundaberg. So he embraced architecture very much because he met colleagues who were keen on it. He knew Lucas and Cummings and all the other architects of that time, in particular Vitaly Gazelle, who did a wonderful holiday house also at Caloundra, at Burgess Street, Metropolitan Caloundra, which is also there, still there. Absolutely superb holiday house. Again, a split level sort of design like this, but except it was on a slope looking towards the ocean.
But do you know where? Because those type of buildings, and you referenced also the American style.
Yeah.
Where did they pick up on that, or how did they know about that? Do you have any idea? Did they?
Well, I think there were magazines. There were plenty of magazines and publications coming out of America, like Progressive Architecture and those other magazines which they subscribed to. And the literature and books that were available on everything from motels to shopping centres and, of course, houses were mainly coming out of America. And I've still got some of those books, and I think they informed the architects of the day of that style. And in many ways, it was sort of more avant-garde than the stuff that we were encouraged to do as students, because there seemed to be a period of austerity come in when we started in the early 60s, that turned its back a bit on this sort of creative modernism that was coming out of the USA in the main. And it's a shame, really, because I was very keen on it and grown up with it. And but architects like Vitaly Gazelle and all the others of that era, Hazen Scott, carried on with those earlier styles. John Dalton was very prominent coming into that era, and he almost arrogantly turned his back on the sort of the norms of architecture, even of the style we were studying, and resolutely persisted with his modern style, you know, and he was a little bit criticised by my father's generation because he tended to just presume that a 4.5-inch thick brick screen wall would stand up of its own accord, you know, and look like a blade wall sticking out from a building in a very modern way. Whereas my father and his ilk were, although they were, you know, embracing the style, they were still very practical and did all their own engineering. I remember Rod Voller doing foundations for a warehouse in Lower Edward Street, Brisbane, where he got them to drive timber piles in 2 feet apart, just sticks of timber to form the foundation, which is just a well-known sort of way of stabilising the ground onto which you could then cast a slab, you know. And he worked it out himself. They did all their own engineering. Yeah.
And you said you worked at, no, I have to check my notes. You worked at Pregnant Crofts and Trude and Webster.
Webster, yes.
Why didn't you start to work at your father's practice, or?
Well, I did as well. Yes, but I, you know, as it is with father and sons, you know, you're not always going to sort of get on that well, but that was just the way it went. And eventually, later on, you know, in the 70s, I came back and worked with him, and was very pleased to do so. But I sort of felt myself that I'd like to, when I did graduate, you know, go to offices that were sort of more high profile. In particular, Jim Birrell's office. Yeah.
Well, before we get onto that, do you remember any of the projects that you worked on at Primary and Crofts and the other Trinity Webster?
Oh, right. Well, Primary and Crofts, I was just given, as a student, I was just given small jobs, and there were small banks and things. And at Truden Webster, I honestly can't remember. But I just remember that Peter O'Gorman working on the very Frank Lloyd Wright-inspired house. Let's see, I did work somewhere else. I think I may have still been a student when I went to Cooranutta and Charlton. And at Cooranutta and Charlton, I was the project architect for their award-winning office building and commercial warehouse premises for William Adams at south of Brisbane. Can't remember the name of the suburb, but it won the award for Cooranutta and Charlton that year. And I was on site as well, supervising the work for them. And my own very first project I did while I was working with Cooranutta and Charlton, I got invited to design the Acacia Ridge Kindergarten, because an old friend I'd grown up with had moved to that very brand new suburb, Acacia Ridge, and to their credit, the local parents had got together and got money to build a kindergarten, and I designed their kindergarten and got it built.
And is that still there?
Yeah. Somebody told me that it had been extended, but I wouldn't have a clue about that. I remember it was opened by Clem Jones, the Lord Mayor of Brisbane, the infamous Lord Mayor of Brisbane. And I introduced myself to him as the architect, and he immediately took an interest in me because I probably looked a bit young and insignificant in the crowd, you know, and because he was a surveyor by trade, Clem Jones, the guy that got rid of the trams and put in the freeways along the river and so on. So that was quite interesting. And I suppose in reality that was my very first my own building, the Acacia Ridge Kindergarten, which I did in my spare time while working for Cooranutta and Charlton. But I think Ian Charlton wasn't very happy about that, but Danny Nutter was quite happy for me to do it.
Was it happy that you didn't bring it into the firm, that you did it on the side?
Yeah. I don't think Ian Charlton particularly wanted it in the firm, because if he did, he would want to design it because he was very strong, you know, in his own field. And I think one of the best buildings that he did was that Twin Towers at New Farm, high-rise residential buildings for a community-based organisation like the Lions or Oddfellows or something like that. One of these beneficial organisations put together to cater for the old age or livelihood of their members, like Rotary and those sort of organisations. Twin residential towers at New Farm, looking across to Kangaroo Point. I can't remember their names or whether they're still there, but they were very, very prominent and notable and well-designed buildings by Ian Charlton.
Doesn't ring.
Yeah, I think they'd be still there.
Is it around where Glenfelloch is?
It's Glenfelloch.
Is it Glenfelloch?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. I thought that was Glenfelloch was Hurst. I thought that was designed by
Morris Hurst.
Yeah.
No.
No, it was Charlton.
Yeah, Ian Charlton, definitely.
Okay.
It's twin buildings, is it?
No, I think it's just one block, and it has the circulation and in glass shafts outside.
Must be a different building, but it's definitely got a name like Glenfelloch, the Twin Towers at Ian Charlton.
Gleneagles.
Gleneagles.
That's the one. Yeah.
Gleneagles.
That's the one.
That's
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I'm there. Yeah, it took me a while. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty amazing that he got them to agree to it, because at that time there were only 2 or 3 high-rise flats in Brisbane, Torbreck at South Brisbane, and one at Red Hill, I think it was.
And
yeah, Red Hill is where we lived, by the way. Anthea and I bought a house in Red Hill in, oh God, about 69, I think it was. Yeah.
And you designed it?
No, it was just an existing Queenslander. House on stumps on a very steep hill, corner of Craig and Zigzag Street, Red Hill.
Oh. Sorry, we're going to jump around a bit, but
sorry.
You already mentioned Cummings and Lucas and Bill Carr and Carl Langer. Are there any other teachers that you remember that stand out? Or?
Yes. Let's think. Stan Marcus Kyle, very practical sort of guy. Very sympathetic though towards students and what they wanted to do. Bill Gregg, a Scotsman, who was wonderful. He was totally dedicated to architecture and in particular the craft of building. You know, he really was interested in the details.
And what did he teach?
He taught general architectural construction, basically. We had very little sort of theoretical, artistic sort of, impartment of knowledge. In fact, one day Robin Boyd came to talk to us, and I was so embarrassed that nobody in the group had a question for Robin Boyd. You know, I'd read his book and known all about him, but the class was mute.
But it was in an interview with Eddie Codd, he said that he initiated this sort of lecture series and that he was the one that got Robin Boyd to come and talk to students, but that there wasn't much support from the architecture faculty for this lecture series. Is that how you...
That'd be right, yes. That's right. I remember now because I think he and others, and I think I was involved a little bit with John Davis in organising lectures at the Institute of Industrial Development or something in Spring Hill. And Morris Hurst gave a very memorable lecture there once. And I think Geoffrey Pye was involved with organising the lectures as well. I think there was a push, by those people, Geoffrey Pye and Eddie Codd and co, to try and challenge the faculty a bit, to move forward and be more progressive. And it was resisted by Lucas and Cummings, but I can understand their position because they were, their position was a bit fragile within the whole university at the time. But I think, if they'd done that, if they'd moved forward a bit, there would have been more people appreciating what they were doing than it would have knocked them, would have objected. They were just very bit conservative, really. Even though their own architecture was, Lucas and Cummings' own architecture was quite progressive, they were a little bit nervous about pushing that line with the public and the powers that be, because Queensland was a very, very conservative place. It was it had been through hard times. Queensland was completely broke on several occasions before the advent of the resources and agricultural booms that came later. It was very, very hard, and to get a hospital built was quite an achievement. That sort of thing.
Based on the interviews that we've done, it seems like the architecture students were quite, it was more in 67 and student protests, that the architecture students were quite involved in all of the protests that occurred, but that, I don't know if you were...
Vietnam, so on, yeah. Yeah, well, I was criticised by one of my colleagues working with Jim Birrell, Russell Kerrison, also the son of an architect from Cook and Kerrison, for going and mounting a protest myself and others that I organised outside the City Hall when Clem Jones, his wife, wanted to install a floor over in the void of one of the entries on the Adelaide Street entry of the City Hall. and they were going ahead and putting a floor into a void, a double height space void of a side entrance to the City Hall. And we mounted a campaign with slogans and outside the entrance there. And I can remember distinctly an official from the City Hall coming out and just abusing us for being layabouts, time wasters, and, you know, what did we do in the war and all that sort of stuff, you know. And then I went on. I mean, Jim Birrell had been the city architect, and I was working for Jim Birrell at the University of Queensland then, and he knew all about this, having been the city architect. But even he was a little bit slightly embarrassed that someone would mount a public demonstration about architecture.
Birrell was.
Yeah, he was. He knew where his bread was buttered. You know, he was very good at pushing his own style, and agendas. But he would never have gone that far. No, he would have risked something too much, I think, doing that. Whereas I had nothing to lose, you know. And then, of course, that attitude of mine, protesting, and my wife and our friends went right through the period of the Bjelke-Petersen years and the police corruption and the Vietnam War and the Springboks tour and all that, which that was part of our lives very much.
But you said you were also involved in the architecture reviews. There was also a political aspect to those, or not really? Not really,
no. I mean, the first we heard of an architecture review was through John Railton and Dick Stringer. Dick Stringer had come from Melbourne and John Railton from Brisbane, but they'd both been at university in Melbourne, as far as I know, and the university reviews had started off in Melbourne, and they've got us organised, and we organised, and they mounted. OWO was our first student review, and I think it was about 1963. And it was really a pun on Omo, which is a washing powder.
Yes.
Hence it's 4p off. And even then, the words "not too blue," even that you could buy blue Omo,
yes,
right, but not too blue meant not too risque, right? So even then, there was a bit of conservatism about the idea of a student review. But this was groundbreaking for the University of Queensland, and the program was just sketches with predominantly an architectural sort of or planning, you know, bent to them. Woolloongabba Pastoral, which was the name I thought up, and John Railton directed it. Consisted of a sort of a little ballet, really, of the traffic of Woolloongabba. Because at Woolloongabba, the five ways, you had cars, trolley buses and trains all crossing the same intersection.
Yes.
So we turned it into a small ballet. And
so it was a criticism of the urban situation.
The urban situation, yeah. And there were references to this Laocoon and Snake, of course, was a ballet also to the famous sculpture of the strong man wrestling with a snake. I can't remember the name of it, but it's Laocoon. It's a famous sculpture from antiquity. Yeah. So a lot of the sketches were based on, for instance, Export Action or SPQR was about Roman architecture. We used Respighi's Pini di Roma as the music for that, which again was a sort of a ballet with costumes and sets and things.
It was all coordinated by Railton and Stringer at first.
Yeah, that's right. And everybody got into it, though. I mean,
all the names look familiar.
Yeah. Tony Rose was a singer and later was the singer for the band that we had in subsequent reviews, which had all sorts of different names. And William Young appeared. There he is.
Yeah.
And
Lecky Ord.
Lecky Ord, yeah. She became the Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Yeah. Yeah, well informed. And Margaret West and Lynn Salmon and
yeah, we've also
John Deschen and
spoken to Richard Allen.
Dick Allen, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dick Allen was he got very much involved with heritage. And he wanted to list our house at Watson Street, Wilston, the one I told you was demolished.
Yes.
He really thought that was a great example of that era. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it didn't happen.
So,
what about, well, we've touched on the curriculum a bit, but...
It was raw.
Yeah.
Compared with what I imagine the faculty's like today. And I hear a bit about it from Gerard Murter, my brother-in-law. I imagine it's totally different, with Britt Anderson's and all the others, with a very sort of deep academic line in architecture that you're probably involved with yourself, but it was very raw in our day, it was basic. But I think people were really interested in it, and everybody had done architecture for a reason. My reason, I suppose, is because my father was an architect and I was reasonably competent in that area. But I can remember the students in our year at the university, they'd all come from somewhere and wanted to do architecture, and it was good.
But they weren't all sons or daughters of architects.
That's right. Yes, I think I was probably a little bit arrogant, really, thinking, I knew a bit about it, and I made a mistake there. I mean, the guys in my year were keener than I was, I'm sure, because they'd made the decision off their own bat,
So you mentioned, you said there was one person, Lawson
McCowan.
The one that stood out.
Yeah. Now, as far as I know, he took a great interest in town planning in later life and may still be on the Gold Coast, where I know he did a lot of work on the development of new suburbs and estates on the Gold Coast. He also did some here in Canberra, I believe. But he'd be worth tracking down. I have no idea how to contact him. We're coming up for our 50th year of graduation. So there'll be an effort to try and get everybody to come together.
Oh, and when would that be?
That'll be in 2016.
Well, I'll be out of the country, but
yes.
It would be interesting for...
Yeah, well, I mean, our course being 6 years, I mean, most degrees only took 3 years,
Yeah.
So the people I started university with from other faculties had finished their degree, by in 3 years, and we were still grinding on because we had this. It was felt that architects had to have practical experience before they could graduate, so we had to do those 3 years part time.
In practice. And were there other students that you thought were significant or stood out?
Well, yes, there was Lawson McCowan, John Davis, Jeff Webster, Graham Hume, and Graham Burke. In particular. There were others, Russell Short and George James. There was a contingent who came from North Queensland, and they were fantastic because they had to drive from Cairns and Townsville to Brisbane to go to university, and they would do that and drive back again at the end of each term, and lived in flats in Brisbane, and there was a bunch of them. George James was the one that comes to mind, and they, I really felt a lot of admiration for them because because of the nature of Queensland. That's another thing. I mean, Brisbane is not Queensland. Queensland is the vast agricultural and rural area that it is. Sydney has always been the centre of New South Wales, without a doubt. but Brisbane was never the centre of Queensland. As far as the politicians was concerned, they represented the country, the rural areas of Queensland, which was what it was all about. And they hated staying in Brisbane, and they hated the Bellevue Hotel, and that's why they didn't care if the Bellevue Hotel got demolished. And I was involved with the protesting on that too, but the Regent Theatre was the main one. But so those students that came long distances to the university in those days were, to me, the heroes, you know. They really, it was a total change of environment for them to come to a relatively large town, city, and to mix with all sorts of people. They tended to stick to themselves, as a group really, to themselves. They lived in university colleges for at least for the first few years of the course, where at least they came into contact with lots of other students, which was good. So yeah, they're the ones. I think Graham Burke in particular did quite well because he became a builder architect, and he did his own building developments. You know,
in Brisbane.
In Brisbane, yeah, Graham Burke.
And during those student years, who were the architects that you most admired or that you were inspired by?
Well, I was inspired very much by Jim Birrell. I was aware of his work, you know, very strongly. And I felt really attracted to it, and I would do anything to get a job in his office, you know. And I got a job at the University Architect's office, where he had become University Architect after being the city architect. And
you got a job there after you finished your degree?
No, I got a job there in fourth year.
In fourth year?
Yeah. And it was an eye-opener, you know, to see how he operated, to see Laurie Cully, his right-hand man, the way he operated, to see how Jim Birrell could produce a book on Walter Burley Griffin while he was still working, and Laurie Cully was doing the illustrations for it, and, you know, it was being put together, and groundbreaking buildings like Union College and the J.D. Story administration building were being built. And I'll just move and get something here. This is Architecture Australia, commemorating Jim Birrell, you know, as the gold medalist recently, and that's the J.D. Story administration building, which I worked on, and as did others. And this drawing is referred to in Architecture Australia, this production, as being by somebody with the initials MJ or something, and it was actually Maury Junner, J-U-A-N-E-R, who was also a very talented architect who worked with Jim. And another one who worked with Jim was David Chesman, spelt Cheeseman, C-H-E-S-M-A-N. And David Chesman was the project architect for Union College. Union College was a college that used to be in the city when the university started at Lower George Street. And Union College was on Gregory Terrace, and the principal of Union College was Professor Max Hickey, the head of the anatomy school and School of Medicine. And he approached Jim Birrell as university architect to design a new college for Union College on the campus at St Lucia. And we all worked on that, and it was a groundbreaker because it used single thickness brick walls between the rooms as the structure itself. It simply had no frame, and Jim Birrell's great friend and mate and drinking and carousing mate Tony Todd, T-O-D, was the structural engineer. And Birrell and Todd were inseparable, and they were notorious.
Okay. And who else was working in the office at the time that you were there?
Well, there was Russell Kerrison, Maureen Mooney, and she married and has a different name now, but Dick Stringer. I said Maury Junna, didn't I? And David Chesman.
Yes.
And who else? Oh, I've forgotten the others. There were a couple of others.
And how long did you stay in Burrell's office?
Oh, in that while he was at university there, I was there. Gosh, why did I leave?
Because then he started his private practice after that, no?
No, I went to Conrad and Gargett.
But Burrell started his private practice.
Yeah, Burrell went into private practice. Yeah.
After that, is that why you left?
I think that's why. Yes, that's it. He concluded his stint as university architect. In fact, the university architect's office was closed, and he went in private practice in the Valley with Laurie Cully, and I think later with Philip Conn. And I got a job with Conrad and Gargett. That's the other firm I hadn't mentioned.
And then that was in fifth year?
Yeah, I was probably about sixth year, I think, by then. Yeah. And
how long did you stay at Conrad?
No, I went to Coronata and Charlton, and then I went to Conrad and Gargett.
Okay.
Yeah.
So fifth year Coronata Charlton, and then sixth year Conrad Gargett.
Yeah, that's it.
And you stayed...
Maybe I'd graduated by the time I went to Conrad and Gargett. Yes, I was graduated by then.
Okay. And do you remember which projects you worked on there?
On Conrad and Gargett. Yeah. I worked on a thing called the Ansett Centre, which was a hotel and office block on Circular Quay. And I worked on buildings at Royal Brisbane Hospital. What else? Just other similar commercial projects. Conrad and Gargett were regarded as the sort of baseline stability establishment practice in Brisbane. They were big, and they'd been going a very long time. And when I told Ian Charlton that I was going to go to Conrad and Gargett, and when they I think they ran out of work at Nutter and Charlton, he said, "Oh, interesting. It's not a bad idea going to a bigger firm," because I knew that he and I think he'd alluded to himself that he and Danny Nutter were struggling, in a small way to make any money. And of course, later on, Ian Charlton joined Conrad and Gargett. So,
but that wasn't at the time you were
there.
No,
much later. Yeah. But I remember him saying to me, "Oh, yeah, go with the corporate strength. Not a bad idea." Because Ian Charlton had come from Bundaberg, where his father was an accountant. And I think he was getting advice that he needed to get with the money, because maybe he wasn't going to develop into a big firm, although I think Ian Charlton had the drive to do it himself. I think he was a very conscientious guy, extremely conscientious.
And the projects that you worked on at Conrad and Gargett was in collaboration with other people, I suppose? Or do you
Conrad and Gargett?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Who did you work with when you were there?
Oh, right. There was there was Peter Gargett and Bill Conrad. And Lou Haley. Lou Haley.
We've spoken to him.
Yeah. Lou Haley was a great guy. They had him as a sort of like a social contact man. He was an Olympian.
Yeah.
He played goalie for the Australian hockey team or something. And he was a very hail fellow, well-met guy and moved in important circles in Brisbane. And so, yeah, I worked with Lou Haley.
And Keith Frost, was he there?
Yeah, Keith Frost was there. He was a very taciturn guy, Keith Frost. And David Chesman, whose name I mentioned earlier, who worked with Birrell, had also come to Conrad and Gargett and got involved with Keith Frost and nearly gave David Chesman a breakdown because Frost was so conservative and David was trying to break new ground with him and I worked with Jim Birrell and was missing Jim Birrell, and Birrell was a bit of an addiction, really. I mean, he was a charismatic guy, there's no two ways about it, and we had all sorts of amazing social times, mainly centering around drink and food. And poor David Chesman, who still lives in Chelmer or somewhere like that.
Mm-hmm.
David Chesman, he's really worth contacting.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just briefly mention about David. He did at a very early stage of his architectural life embrace computer technology,
mm-hmm.
and was very good at it, and went to work for some of the bigger firms on commercial projects, and was able to be very useful in that regard, something I regret not having done. And so that was Conrad and Gargett.
And were you working there at the time that they were doing SGIO, or did that happen
SGIO,
later?
I think, was
Later?
under construction.
Mm.
Yeah, the SGIO Theatre, which was part of that complex, was where I stage managed the first ever production of the Queensland Theatre Company, which was Royal Hunt of the Sun. And because I'd been in student theatre. I'd not even been in Dramatic Society, but I'd been in another group of student theatre people with Brian Nason, and I had stage managed Shakespeare in Brisbane's Festival Hall, which was a boxing venue. That was Hamlet and Macbeth. But anyway, that's an aside. No, the SGIO building, as it was called, now something else. Suncorp, yeah, was under construction, I think, as I recall. And that's right, and it was very near King George Square, which at the time Clem Jones had turned into a car park with a lid on top.
And when did you get involved in the Save the Region?
Oh, right. Well, after I'd been at Conrad and Gargett, I went back to Jim Birrell in private practice in the Valley, where I worked on and did most of the design work and documentation for the Resource Materials Centre, or library, at the Darling Downs Institute of Technology, which is now called the University of Toowoomba or something. And I also worked on the master plan. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I worked on the master plan for Mount Gravatt University with Dick Stringer and Jim Birrell. The three of us did that master plan for Mount Gravatt, which was raw bushland at Mount Gravatt, where we did a master plan which unfortunately wasn't followed in great detail. It was subsequently interfered with by a town planner from Canberra, whose name I can't remember, who changed the layout of the campus.
But Mount Gravatt, wasn't Blythe Bretnell also involved in?
Probably.
But that was the agricultural college. That was
buildings, was it?
The buildings, yeah.
Yeah, this was the master plan.
The master plan for it.
Yeah, we did a master plan for Mount Gravatt and the Townsville campus, which has become the James Cook University, and for one in New Guinea, in a university institution in New Guinea. I've got that report somewhere of the Mount Gravatt one, and I'll look for it in a minute. And so as you can see, my role was not so much in my own right. It was always following in, but I always wanted to work with a more notable type of firm, you know. I don't know what that says about me, but I enjoyed doing that, and I learned a lot, and I think it sort of broadened my mind and so on. And when I went to work with Jim Birrell in private practice, I also worked on buildings at the University of Townsville, individual buildings at the University of Townsville. And
do you remember which buildings?
Yeah, the arts building, which has the sort of shoehorn type sunshades. Yeah, that was the library, at Townsville, and this was the library at Toowoomba, which had a similar roof to this.
Yeah.
Instead of the curved walls, it had staggered brick walls of different heights as the perimeter. And this is the arts building that I worked on. And I remember going back to the University of Queensland that had a solar scope to test these sun hoods with the technician in the faculty at the university. They had a solar scope, which was the sun replicated on a pole, shining on a base where you could put a model of the building and so on.
Yeah.
And so we developed that. And I think I worked on a couple of buildings in New Guinea as well with Jim. And then I went to England.
When was that? Which year?
That was 1972.
And what?
And I went.
Made you decide to go there?
My wife is English, and her family was in London, and we decided to catch up with her family, and we went there, and then I got a job, and it was with Sir Basil Spence, Bonington and Collins, and they were in Fitzroy Square in London, and my main involvement there was at Sussex University. Sussex University had been, a competition was held, and Basil Spence had won the competition. It was a red brick university, and one of the few early universities other than the main ones, Cambridge and Oxford. And I worked on new buildings for arts, the arts faculty, and chemistry. And then I subsequently did lots of other work at other academic institutions in north of England, and also some work in the Middle East, which was just starting to happen then. The Middle East, yeah.
But that was while you were at Basil Spence from there, and which projects were those then that you worked
in the Middle East?
Yes.
There was a hotel and a zoo in Doha. But by that time, Jack Bonington had come forward as the main partner. And we had moved the office from London to a Jacobean mansion, derelict mansion in the countryside near St Albans in Hertfordshire in England. And Jack Bonington was really taking over the practice by then, and he was a frontier man for the Middle East, which was emerging, and he would go to the Middle East and sleep in and wait in lobbies for ages until sheikhs came for meetings, and he would get the job and come back, and we would start work and do these amazing things that they want to spend their money on. The zoo in Doha had outdoor air conditioning, and the hotel was just crazy. There was no expense spared at all. You know, we just got teak, loads of teak, and whatever they wanted, really. It was just astounding. You know, the money was just starting to flow out of the oil-rich states on the Gulf.
And how long did you stay at the...
4 years.
4 years, so 1976.
Yeah. So I'm beyond your period by now, but...
That's fine.
Really enjoyed working there in England. It was very hard. It was very hard with money because the oil price went up, and we were living in the country. We had to have two cars and oil central heating, and it just became virtually impossible to keep going. And so we came back to Australia, but I think we'd always planned to come back to Brisbane anyway. And when I did come back, I joined my father.
And where was his practice at the time?
The practice, we set up a new office, my father and I, in the Master Builders building in Spring Hill. In that terrace that runs, the one in which the Tower Mill Motel is. I can't remember the name of that road, but it runs past a park, Albert Park, up to the top of Spring Hill itself. Anyway, that was where the office was, and we did general work. You know, we had work from government in schools, and I remember out of the blue I got a police station to do at Clayfield by Don Lane, the disgraced Minister for Police, who was obviously doing it as a bribe to the electors of Clayfield to get himself back into government with Joe Bjelke-Petersen, where he was the police minister. And it had to be documented in record time. And I did it, and it got built. I went to the opening still having not been paid. And Don Lane came up to me and said, I guess you got your fees pretty quick on this one, Jack. And I said, well, I've never been paid. So he organised payment. But that was obviously was offline as far as the work department was concerned in producing police stations. It wasn't planned at all. He just introduced it as police minister as a project to be done in his electorate. So that was going on all the time.
And what was the firm called at the time? It was just you and your
father?
father?
It's called John Kershaw Architects.
John Kershaw Architects.
Yeah.
And it was just you and your father, or did other people work there? No.
We had several people working, yes.
Do you remember any of them? Yeah,
there was Ian Stitchell, who has since gone on to be a director, I think, of the former Cook and Kerrison, where it was a firm that existed, and Ian Stitchell went to work for them, and I think he's a partner there. And Larry Canua, as he called himself, Knauer, who was a very good young architect. And we worked on projects for the Scouts Association, for their administrative buildings and their camps and things, where they had permanent buildings all over Queensland. And Larry Canua went on to work for who's the female architect who's done very well recently and is doing a hospital on the Sunshine Coast?
Not Peter Skinner's wife.
Yeah, Peter Skinner's wife. You know who I mean?
Yeah. The name.
Anyway, that lady, whose name I'll think of, had been my father's client. That lady's father. Yeah, it'll come to me. Anyway, Larry Canua, who worked with me, went on to work with her in her new practice, which is not Design Inc. It's the one that the famous Sunshine Coast architect and his wife, Architectus.
Architectus, yes.
Architectus. Architectus is now Libby Watson Brown.
Libby Watson Brown. Yes.
Yeah, well, Libby Watson Brown's parents had been my father's clients, and he was a doctor, Watson Brown, and Libby worked in our office for a short while.
Okay.
In John Kershaw Architects, and I think she was still a student then, and so it's all connected up in Brisbane.
Yeah.
And the only high flyer that I didn't sort of work with really, I suppose, was Robin Gibson.
And did you want to work for Robin?
No, not really. I thought his architecture was rather sterile, although very, very competent. And Bill Heather, who I mentioned earlier, had worked closely with Robin Gibson. And Robin Gibson was very much connected with the Liberal Party of us. So politically, he was very strong, and was a great mate of Bob Mathers, who had a shoe shop in Queen Street.
He did the shoe shops.
And they pretty much were responsible for creating the Queen Street Mall, or Mall, however you like to pronounce it, Robin Gibson and Mathers said, look, this is the worst retail precinct in the world. Looking at Queen Street, what can we do about it? And they talked the government into turning it into a mall and closing off the traffic, which was a shame in many ways because, well, for a start, the theatres had their entrance off Queen Street, you know, the Her Majesty's Theatre, the Tivoli and the Regent. So they had addresses to streets. So with the mall, they no longer had addresses. And in any case, they were doomed. And so Robin Gibson was the only one I really didn't come into contact much. But during the Save the Regent campaign, he was sort of quite supportive in a way, without being too overt, because nobody had ever taken on such a massive campaign, public campaign to preserve something like this. Even the Bellevue. The Bellevue had a higher profile because it was very much the bailiwick of Joe Bjelke-Petersen, where his country party politicians hated to have to be put up and stay there, so they didn't care if it got knocked down. But the Regent Theatre was a much more controversial issue in the bigger sense, because the University of Queensland was the beneficiary of the main estate that owned the Regent Theatre site and part of the building. And
so when did the Save the Regent campaign start?
The Save the Regent campaign started in about 19. I was going to show you a photograph of the actual start of it. Sorry, I just have to find this. Oh, we're miles up here. And I'm looking for somebody called Steve. Here he is. This young fella is a movie maker called Steve Malloy, who I mentioned before, who's making a film about the Regent. And he does all this amazing stuff himself. And that's what we propose to do at the back. And I think he's busily trying to put all that into the modern idiom, you know, of what we were doing. This is the one where David Hunter, Kent Chadwick and I won this John Herbert Award, which was the National Trust's award for the most successful public campaign. By that time, we had virtually lost it and were completely exhausted. But so that's not the actual start of it. There's another one from Steve here. This one, we're in 19. There we are. Looking very sort of 70s look, I suppose. That's Gavin Patterson, who is fellow, slightly younger than me. Ken Chadwick is a movie maker and a bit of a BMOC, as he used to be called, big man on campus at the university. And me, I'd come back from England by then, and this was 1978. And
who's those pictures? Where do those pictures come from? Do you know?
This was from the newspaper. And
Courier Mail?
Yeah, I think. And Steve, this movie maker, had somehow got hold of it. And decided to send it to me. I'd forgotten about it, to tell you the truth. And I was...
So who initiated the campaign originally?
Those three.
You three together?
Gavin was an architect, fellow architect, a bit younger. Kent's a movie maker, and myself. And we were so appalled. I was so appalled mainly because of the loss of a venue, having been involved with student theatre and seeing how Brisbane lacked venues that were affordable. I wasn't really so much involved with heritage. I was involved with the actual practical reuse of it as a theatre. It was a 3,000-seat theatre, and it had a wonderful stage, a fly gallery, but not very much depth to the stage, as I said. And we just assumed that people would automatically think the same way as we did. And there were a lot of supporters. We had 40,000 signatures. Oh God, I've got so much stuff on this, you can believe. But it showed me, I learnt about myself. I learnt that my father was a Congregationalist, which is a type of religion whereby the congregation doesn't believe in any hierarchy. And I think I must have inherited something like that, that the people could suddenly stand up and automatically be able to be heard, and the authorities would automatically take notice. But the reverse is what happens. The authorities react against
standing up.
Yeah, people who stand up. And that certainly was the case in Brisbane. And that was our first ever brochure, which we circulated millions of copies of. And it's fairly amateurish by today's standard in terms of presentation, the way it was done. This was all done in Michael Bryce's office. And we had been in touch with all sorts of people around the world to get support. And we had 40,000 signatures. That was the three of us in that photograph here. And support from the National Trust, various organisations, various theatrical entrepreneurs, unions, orchestras, festivals, plenty of press, and so on. And we had support from Warren Mitchell, the British actor, who did a free concert for us, The Thoughts of Chairman Alf, in Her Majesty's Theatre. Save the Regent. He did an R-rated performance of Alf Garnett's For Nothing. He did For Nothing for us, and supported the campaign.
And how long did the campaign run for?
It ran for 3 years, and we achieved a 6-month green ban from the unions.
And what is that?
Well, in Sydney, Mundy, George Mundy, is that his name? He was the leader of the Building Labourers Federation, and he was the first in Australia to come up with the concept of green bans, which were a ban by the builders' labourers on any construction or demolition of heritage work. And in particular in Sydney, it was the Rocks area. And we successfully got a green ban applied to the Regent Theatre by the building union. Because Kent Chadwick and I had discovered documents from the University of Queensland that proved that the offer they were receiving as beneficiaries of the estate that owned the land from Hoyts, the organisers of the redevelopment, the demolition and redevelopment, was no good, was not a good deal. And so the university went along with the green ban in order for their deal to be either thrown out or improved. And at that time we were very much competing with Hoyts to run the theatre. And we were doing that through two guys who operated Her Majesty's Theatre, which was just down the road in Queen Street, which was also closing. And those two gentlemen were going to take over the lease of the theatre and just start it up and run it as a theatre. And that's what we were concerned about, just getting it operational as a theatre for a huge range of things, you know, ballet, pop concerts, orchestral concerts, musicals, that range of theatre, you know, that could take a 3,000-seat audience. And we were so certain that was obvious as, you know, the nose on your face, that's what they should be doing in Queensland, because there were no theatres left of that type, you know. This so-called picture palace style was disappearing. The Regent in Sydney was in the process of being demolished. We sited the Regent in Melbourne, which was being refurbished, and so we were certain that somehow or other the powers that be in Queensland would see the light and agree with us, you know. And we were very close, because the director of the National Party, which was Joe Bjelke-Petersen's party, Mike somebody, was an actor as well as being the director of the National Party. And he went to a concert which was billed as the last night of the Regent, and he was on stage doing some musical act, and he looked into the auditorium and realised what a spectacular place it was. And he went to Joe at our request and asked Joe to invoke the University of Queensland Act. University of Queensland is a state government act that controls the University of Queensland. It still exists. The state government of Queensland can do things under that act that affect the University of Queensland. The Vice-Chancellor would be aware of this. And Bjelke-Petersen, who had lost brownie points in relation to heritage on the Bellevue issue, which was demolished, you know, overnight by thugs, and here was this Regent one that he could do something about, and he was very close to invoking the University of Queensland Act. So we ended up being very ambivalent and of two minds about Joe. You know, he was an idiot, he was hated, he was right-wing, he was fascist and all that, but he could save the Regent. And so we were just hoping that he would do that. And this Mike Evans guy was suggesting that Joe could do that, but Joe didn't do it. It was not in his nature to be so public and controversial about a thing such as heritage. So that's as close as we got. And then it was demolished at night. You know, an advertisement was flashed on a drive-in movie screen owned by Hoyts, who were the people trying to get the lease of the theatre for conversion into 3 cinemas. They flashed an ad on their drive-in movie screen, wanted labourers to do a job in the city at night. And they went into the theatre ceiling and kicked it down in the night. And then nothing happened, you know, they just did enough to
damage it.
To damage it, you know. So
beyond.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't beyond repair, but it just stayed like that. Yeah, there's the audience of the last night of the Regent in 1978. A full house, 3,000 people. You know, this is the concert at which that guy from the National Party. And there we are outside, demonstrating.
And at the time, you were still working in your father's office?
Yes. And going backwards, you know, financially. My father was scratching his head, and my mother was scratching her head. And I was just hanging it together. I was just able to do enough work, you know, and I was quite busy. And I had these 2 or 3 guys working with me. We were carrying on, and then I really sort of ran into a brick wall after the Regent thing. I got a sort of, I don't know where it is, sort of a phobia about public meetings and places and things. Sort of agoraphobia, which I had no idea about. It just came out of the blue. And I'd been asked by the National Trust to go on their board to help them with public issues. Because the National Trust had tried to save the theatre, and they had a scheme where they'd turned it into two. And up the gallery, up here, up above this would be one, and this main auditorium would be another. And it was stupid. And it was supported by Zelman Cowan, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Queensland. He was very high profile, and I think he thought that at that time the university and the National Trust had found an answer. But Hoyts weren't interested in that, nor were the trustees of the main estate. And we thought, of course, we had the answer, which was simple. Just if it was going to be able to be operated on this last night, it must therefore be operational right off. No work done at all. So, and that's what the operators from the Her Majesties agreed. They said, you don't have to do anything, you just turn the lights on, where we go. And even the building didn't need building approval because they used it. And so Kent survived. Kent went back into being part of the Film Corporation in Melbourne, and David Hunter went to America, and Gavin Patterson went somewhere else, and I went to Sydney. But it took a while to get over it, and I sort of discovered something, I think, about myself, and I discovered that these sort of issues can really take a toll, especially if you believe in them very strongly, naively or whatever. But we had developed it to the point of being, financially viable.
Was that also the time in which Cloudland was demolished?
Later on.
That was later.
Yeah, I was in Sydney by then. Yeah, I just used to hear about these things from my friends in Queensland.
And did that bring up some?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, I knew what they were on about, and I think. But as I said, at that time I thought heritage was a little bit sort of crazy. There was the ICOMOS Charter and all that sort of stuff, which was all very well, but all we were interested in was just the practical use of this amazing venue, which was obviously part of Queensland's history and all that, but just the fact that you had a 3,000-seater in the middle of the city with fully equipped was, from my student days with theatre, was what attracted me to it. And Robin Gibson, as I said, came along and surreptitiously supported us, and I think you could see we're on the right track. But then another Save the Region campaign sprang up only recently. You're probably aware of that one. This group here. This is only a matter of a couple of years ago. This guy Mike Gillies, who's writing a book about it, who's wary of the filmmaker.
Oh yeah.
He was this guy Gillies, absolute nut about all this sort of stuff. All the heritage stuff, all the picture palette stuff. Which I thought was very good. It's nice and all that. And they're all over the world and so on. But architecturally, I wasn't that thrilled by it all. It was just there, just an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And but Mike Gillies did his own computer graphics of how the theatre could be developed. It's not in here, but
redeveloped to its former glory.
Yeah, that's right. Rebuilt, because they almost like guiltily they left the box of the theatre alone when they converted it into 3 cinemas. They left the box in which this theatre sat there.
Yeah.
The walls, the back walls, the roof,
still there.
But the lobby, of course, which was the main heritage listed bit, which goes from Queen Street through to the theatre itself, and sits on main estate land. It was preserved, in the deal as being the new entrance to the 3 cinemas. And so it was strange that they didn't just obliterate the lot and build 3 cinemas. It was almost as if they were sort of feeling guilty about it, and that maybe in the future that something could be done, you know. Because there was a strong feeling that, yes, it should have been saved and used, as happened in Melbourne. And all other places all around the world. And now every city in Australia has a picture palace style thing. Brisbane doesn't. And anyway, I've just heard recently from one of my colleagues who was involved with this, now in his 80s, who has been talking to the filmmaker, that the development by multiplex stroke Brookfield, which was a tower block on top of this, has stopped, completely stopped, and they've taken all their equipment away from the site and everything, having demolished the rest of it, the box. So God knows what's going on. So again, the site is I think the main estate is out of it now. The university has no more connection with it. The University Medical School was the beneficiary of the main estate that owned the land. And so that's why the university was in a position to stop it. And I remember Kent Chadwick and I went to the university, to the JD Story building, and went in to see the Vice-Chancellor. We went up to the top floor without an appointment. We walked in and there was nobody there at the reception, but on the receptionist's desk was a pile of reports with a negative financial return to the university as a result of the Hoyts thing, which we just stole. We walked out with it and used that clandestinely as evidence to get the green ban applied. The unions in Queensland at the time were sort of like needed the publicity and were keen to put the green ban on. And the green ban was effective. Nothing happened for 6 months. And but I don't think that was committed as the Builders Labourers Federation in Sydney was to the Rocks and King's Cross under Jack Mundy. Jack Mundy has become a legend in Australian history now as a creator of the green bans. So that sort of started to define who I was and what I was interested in,
And from there you went on to Sydney.
Sydney, and worked on those projects in the Rocks and then to Canberra to work in Parliament House and back into private practice from here. And that's it. And I'm still very interested in public affairs, in architecture and planning in Canberra, and get published a lot in the Canberra Times. My opinions, that is, and get asked to comment on things,
And if you'd had to, because we're running out of tape already, if you had to say what your most important project was that you worked on, not necessarily your own, but project that you worked on maybe in other firms, which one would that be?
Oh God, I think probably something with Jim Birrell. I'd have to say the one I had the most involved with was the Resource Materials Centre at the Darling Downs Institute of Technology, because that was the one that he gave me the most free rein on. Laurie Cully was always there to talk about it, and Tony Todd, the structural engineer, was there to deal with the massive cantilevering roof and how we're going to integrate that with the windows and all that sort of thing. And it was a full-on involvement through the full documentation, dealing with the government, who were the owners of the campus, and getting it built. It was an interesting situation because it was part of a group of architects that had been called in by their works department to do buildings at that campus. There was John Dalton. John Dalton had done nothing bigger than a house and was asked to do a school of music or something. And he did a very demure building with wheat on the roof, which he thought would fit in with the Darling Downs, where they grew wheat, which is nearby, I'm talking about, And Birrell laughed at him. very cruelly. And Ian Charlton was involved as well. And Ian Charlton was doing his usual sort of rather uptight presentation. And again, Birrell just laughed. He's so irreverent as a guy, you know, that Ian Charlton was trying to be very formal, and which he was, and he's a great guy. Ian Charlton is first class architect. But Birrell was simply wild, you know. Something attracted me to him, I think, in that regard. I don't know. I can never be like that myself, but I mean, lots of people like to work for him for that reason, because he was a liver of life, you know.
It's flamboyant.
Yeah, I wrote a sort of a statement about him in Architecture Australia that the editor asked me to write. I decided to use a very long sentence, and I thought it might have some literary impact. But when I read it now, it's just a long sentence. 10 tributes to Birrell, and that's mine there.
First one.
Yeah, and I like to use words like his buildings studded the environment, you know, because he was a stud and all that.
Studded the environment.
Yeah, that's right. Let's see, I've got some notes here. See if I've missed anything.
I think the other question was, which buildings that were constructed in the period that we're looking at do you consider significant, either personally or generally?
Well, they'd have to be Birrell's buildings, I think. All of them, really. And certainly the ones I worked on, like Union College, JD Story, the other ones I mentioned. Yeah.
And are there any of the other architects that you... or outside of Brisbane, can you think of any?
Outside of Brisbane? Well, overseas, you mean?
No, in Queensland, but not in Brisbane.
Oh, yeah. Well, God, I'm sure there are. I'm trying to think. But
do you know the work of Eddie Orban? Or
Eddie Orban, yeah, genius. Aficionado of Frank Lloyd Wright in a way, or even Bruce Goff. You know Bruce Goff? Yeah, well, he's way out, and certainly Jerry Merton, my brother-in-law, has gone in search of Eddie Orban's buildings, and himself also. And the other architects who I really appreciate, of course, are Rex Addison, our strong friend, and Russell Hall, and Don Watson. Don Watson, who worked with me with Jim Birrell in Jim Birrell's office. I forgot about Don. Yeah, Don is an absolute treasure, as is his wife, and his father was a surgeon and was also, you know, frantic hard worker, compulsive hard worker like Don is. Don Watson has done some wonderful buildings, and he was a superb draftsman. Bruce Goodser, who worked with Birrell also, who was the son of Goodser and
Baker.
Carlisle. Yeah.
Wasn't Goodser, Baker, and what?
Yeah, they became Goodser Baker while, but they were Goodser and Carlisle first of all. Yeah, and then Bruce Goodser went all over the world and ended up in Tasmania. Quite difficult guy to work with, I thought, but very good architect. What other names come to mind that you'd be thinking about, sort of outside Brisbane?
No,
Eddie Orban.
Eddie Orban is the only one that I can really think of. We've been trying to think of others, but Eddie Orban is the only name that keeps on popping up outside of Brisbane. So
yeah, well, he there were some architects in it was Cold Tesch, who was based in Bundaberg, Tesch, German name. He did a lot of interesting buildings outside of Brisbane. Of course, most of the buildings outside of Brisbane were done by Brisbane architects in that period.
By the Works Department?
By the Works Department as well. And the Works Department had some very good architects. God, their names have eluded me now, but one who...
Wasn't Hitch? John Hitch?
John Hitch, yeah.
At the Works Department?
Yeah, and there was European guy. What's his name? He he was the one that called together the group to do the buildings at the Darling Downs Institute of Technology. He got in Birrell, Charlton and Dalton. Can't remember his name.
And from where in Europe? Whereabouts from in Europe?
Works department in that era, in the 60s. I might ring you with that.
That's fine.
Yeah. I'll just look here. Dick Stringer, Ian Shelton, Lucas and Cummings, Railton, Morris Hurst. Morris Hurst and I used to go over to Stradbroke Island surfing. Yeah, it was great. Those days, there was no $1 million shacks on that island then.
There are now.
There were shacks, but they were just shacks. And oh yeah, my father designed the Queensland Teachers Union building in Boundary Street, Spring Hill.
And what was that?
That was in the 70s. I think it was while I was away. And it was a building like a pyramid. It's made of concrete, but it leans in. He just followed the setbacks that were required as you go up from the boundary. And it's still there. And the drawings are in the Friar.
So this collection, the collection of the office went to Friar?
Yeah, including the Watson Street house and the Holiday House at Dicky Beach.
Yeah.
But I think the main drawings of the Holiday House are with my sister Helen Kershaw and Jared Murter at Moffat Beach, Caloundra, where they live. Jerry's a part-time lecturer at the university, faculty. Have you ever, you know? Oh,
sorry.
Right. Well, I don't know. He's been doing it for years and years. He goes down on Thursday nights, I think it is. Is there something happening at Ipswich as well?
I don't know.
Oh, right, because he stayed with Rex Addison at Mount Crosby because he had to go into Ipswich to lecture there at the University of Queensland's off campus there. I don't know what faculty. It would have to be architecture.
Well, I'm in the research group. I'm 100% research, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Righto, well, Jerry knows Bridge and all that lot. And, of course, the former head of the school who became Deputy Vice Chancellor and got into some trouble. Who's his name?
I'm bad with names.
Mike. Englishman.
Yes.
Very charming fellow. Anyway, Jerry knows him very well. Jerry taught Donovan and Hill.
Really?
Yeah, they're his protégés.
Yeah,
I mean, they're brilliant.
That might bring us to another question. Which buildings constructed in Queensland after the 1975 period do you think are noteworthy or significant?
Yeah, definitely. Well, Robin Gibson was responsible mainly for the South Bank, which is a formulaic thing using lots of bush-hammered concrete and modernist forms. But the library there, I think, is just amazing. What they call occupiable outdoor spaces. I mean, that's something which I think is an absolute breakthrough in terms of design for Queensland climate. Brilliant. And even though Donovan Hill did this house that replaced our very own house at Watson Street, Wilston, I still think they are absolutely top architects. Totally committed and totally talented and totally driven. And also architectus that was who did the Modern Art Museum in South Bank. Goma. Who's that? Who's the architect? Well, I know him as well as anything. Massive cantilevering roof, husband and wife outfit. Can't remember his name. lots of work on the Sunshine Coast. Can't remember his name, but that Goma, I think, is a great building. Jim Birrell is very critical of it. He says it's a derivative of something. I said, what do you mean, Jim, derivative? You know all about derivative.
And what did he say then?
He just grunts. And yeah, poor, I hope this is not running now, but...
Oh, it is.
Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Frankie Birrell, his wife, told me she is currently fighting a battle because she is a painter and artist.
Yes. I read about that in the newspaper.
It's in the newspaper.
Well, if it's what you're talking about the painting that supposedly was painted.
Signed by Blackman.
And it was a painting by her. Yes.
Some dealer unscrupulously got Blackman to sign these and is now telling everybody that they're Blackman's.
But they're hers, I thought I read that in the newspaper.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah, well, they came to dinner the night before Frankie was telling us the story. She was very upset. Yeah, they would be the main ones. I mean, there are lots of other buildings I can think of, but since then, that period, God, what else? Rex Addison's buildings, of course, are just wonderful. I mean, he is totally dedicated to what Hagebeck dubbed regionalism. But really, as far as Rex is concerned, that is the way to build. You know, to know your materials, to know what timber can do, and to know that, for instance, roof trusses are very bad these days. They're just made out of sticks of pine, and they're concealed and not visible. And really, a roof has to consist of a roof truss as a primary element, and purlins, and secondary beams, and battens, and rafters. You know, that was the hierarchy of building, using those structural elements in timber, and that was it. You know, don't argue. And Rex is so very, very good at it. His own house, his own 2 houses, his studio, and of course the one now, the conversion at Mount Crosby, and all the other work he did in New Guinea and everywhere else. Bloody brilliant. And John Railton, of course, goes on and on. And Russell Hall, I mentioned, and Don, and those are the ones that come to mind. Yeah. Okay. From our own group, I don't think there's anything that really stands out. Just all competent stuff, I think. What else has been built in that part of the world these days? Robin Gibson did those buildings, a hall in front of the university main building. Yes. Yeah. Which is now not even a hall, it's something else now.
It's what's it called?
Something or other.
Main hall?
It's called the main hall, the main estate, Mayne, which owned the land of the Regents on. It became something else since then, converted to some other use. Okay.
Is there anything else that you think we've missed or that you would like to add to our conversation?
Yeah, the main topic is that post-war period, which has been documented a fair bit, hasn't it? In that little book, The Architecture of Queensland, and so on. And of course, a lot of heritage stuff that Bob Riddell knows all about. But I think it's a good topic, that post-war period, because it's very formative for the growth of that part of the world and Queensland as well, because it really was struggling. Brisbane, in particular, third, fourth cousin of the other cities, regarded as Hicksville Junction, and it's come to light. It's come to age, albeit with too many freeways and too many tunnels and too many high-rise, 80-storey blocks of flats and all that stuff that really migrated from the Gold Coast. Okay.
Well, thank you for the interview.
My pleasure.